Hi, Marie Filion here, and today we're talking about the 7 types of ADHD. We're going to approach this from a neuropsychological and a neurobiological understanding. So it's important to note that ADHD is classified as a developmental disorder, which means through development, so that's before 18 years old, and it's diagnosed through a clinical history over a prolonged period of time. So brain imaging is not necessary to make that diagnosis, but in complicated cases, it's really helpful. So I've had students that have had 7 of the 7 types. So just to let you know, 50% of children are going to carry ADHD into adulthood. So that's important to note. And I have another YouTube that talks about the link between addictions and ADHD. So not all kids with ADHD are even predestined to have addictions, but they can have more of a chance of getting it. So 66% of ADHD has an origin in trauma. 33% is just purely developmental. So 5 out of 7 of the ADHD types have a low prefrontal cortex, which is what we would classify as the thinking brain. And over 60% have neurodevelopmental origins. So when you have different students that have a psychological evaluation and they have the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorder, that is one of the ADHD types. So there's 5 basic symptoms of ADHD that is common to all of the types. The first is a short attention span for regular, routine, everyday tasks. So they tend to get bored because the particular activity doesn't provide the stimulation that their prefrontal cortex needs. So number 2 is they're distractible. And that occurs with people, again, because the prefrontal cortex is too low to help the rest of the brain monitor how much sensory information is being processed. So they're distracted by lights, sounds, smells, certain tastes, and even the clothing that they wear. The next one that is very characteristic is they are disorganized. So people with ADHD tend to have trouble with time and space in addition to keeping their spaces tidy, especially their rooms and their book bags, filing cabinets, drawers. There was one classroom I entered and I looked at the desks and I could tell which kids were ADHD because there was just papers just oozing out of them. I'm like, oh, is that his desk? And it's like, uh-huh. Okay, so that is very characteristic of ADHD. So it's partially because they have a weak cerebellum. So a cerebellum is right here in the back of your head, and it actually has 50% of our neural connections. So it's a very, very important part of the brain. So it is not only responsible for movement, but it also organizes our thoughts. So when we have ADHD, there's a low prefrontal cortex. The cerebellum doesn't seem to be working very well, and there's a cross connection between the cerebellum and the prefrontal cortex that is usually not very strong. Another symptom, the fourth one, is procrastination. So tasks and duties are put off until the last moment. The fifth one is poor internal supervision. So the judgment and impulse control, and they struggle not to say or do things without fully thinking them through. So they have a harder time learning from their mistakes, which can be very frustrating for them and the people in their world. So currently, according to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychologists and counselors use, there are only 3 types. So there's the inattentive, the hyperactive, and the combined. But if we look at this from the neurobiology of the brain, we see different things. So executive functions and development are also affected in ADHD. So our working memory is often not working very well. So you have short-term memory, so the number of things that you can keep in your brain, and then working memory takes those number of things and does things with it. So that's what working memory is. So the separation of affect and emotional control. So affect is just emotion, okay? So they have an issue with that. Internalizing of language and self-talk, that doesn't seem to be working very much. The analysis and synthesis of information. So that again is the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the cerebellum. So what we need to do is we need to improve working memory, and these are some of the things that I've used. So Power Up, CogMed, separation of affect and emotional control. I'm going to get into that a little later. Internalization of language and self-talk. That's teaching an analytical approach really helps. The reconstitution and analysis and synthesis is done by something called DDP. That's something that I use quite often. And what DDP stands for is dyadic developmental psychotherapy. And that is a method that works very, very well with ADHD. So here are the 7 types. So these first 3 are the ones that are in the DSM. Okay, so the classic, the inattentive, the overfocused is the combination one. Okay, the 4th one is the temporal lobe ADHD. And then you have the limbic ADHD, you have a ring of fire ADHD, and you have the anxious ADHD. So these last 4 are characteristically on psychological evaluations going to be classified as neural developmental disorder. So the classic type is characterized by inattentive, distracted, disorganized, restless, and impulsive. So again, prefrontal cortex and cerebellum, but there's also low dopamine that is going on in this brain. So here's a really great scan that shows you the before, and this area here, that's your prefrontal cortex. And then after we do some work with this child, look at this, so much more. And these holes, there's not actually holes in the brain. This represents blood flow. And so is that kiddo actually using that part of his brain? Okay, so I don't want you to think that kids actually run around with holes in their brain. The second one is inattentive. They're easily distracted, disorganized, not very impulsive or hyperactive. They often described as space cadets, daydreamers, or couch potatoes, not hyperactive. So again, they have a low prefrontal cortex and cerebellum, but they have low dopamine is what is going on. So again, here's the prefrontal cortex. You see quite severe, like nothing going on here, right? And then after treatment. Okay, so there's hope. Okay, the third one is the overfocused. So inattentive plus overfocused, they're worrying, oppositional, they hold grudges, they have trouble shifting gears, they frequently get stuck in loops of negative thoughts or behaviors. They can be obsessive, inflexible, frequent oppositional and argumentative behavior. Again, prefrontal cortex and the increased what we call anterior cingulate gyrus. So that's a part of the brain that is in between the cortex, the thinking brain, and the emotional brain. And so it's the gear shifter, and they just can't seem to shift gears. So they are low in serotonin. So the overactive or overfocused increases the cingulate activity. So the anterior cingulate gyrus is just very, very active. Okay. The 4th one is a temporal lobe ADHD, and so they will tend to have temper problems, mood instability, irritability, memory problems, learning disabilities, disorganized, short fuse, dark thoughts, may or may not be hyperactive. So they have an abnormal temporal lobe, and then they have low GABA, and GABA is another neurotransmitter, and GABA is responsible for calming. Okay, so it's an inhibitory. So here's your temporal lobe. So the mark would decrease left temporal lobe activity. So here we have a lot less activity than we do here. Okay, and you can notice on this kiddo, prefrontal cortex not as active either. Number 5, the limbic ADHD, inattentive plus chronic low-level sadness or negativity, glass half empty thinking. Mood instability, tends to be more socially isolated, and frequent feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So again, low prefrontal cortex, but the high limbic. So your thinking brain is low, but your emotional brain is high. So you can see how that can cause a lot of problems. So in this one, limbic ADHD is marked with increased limbic, basal ganglia. So basal ganglia is part of the emotional brain. And then the cingulate, so the anterior cingulate gyrus, is also a lot more active in this. Ring of fire. And if you listen to my diction talk, you've heard me talk about the ring of fire. So it's inattentive plus hyperactive, impulsive, mood instability, cyclic moodiness, oppositional, sensitive to noise and touch, excessive brain activity. So there's, right, a ring of fire just going on. So they have low dopamine and low GABA levels. Excuse me. So here you can see why it's called the ring of fire. Okay, so a lot of activity going on here and not necessarily in the best places. So prefrontal cortex, nah, not so much. The anger primitive, a lot of going on there. So increased activity in the cingulate gyrus, parietal lobes, frontal lobes, and temporal lobes. Anxious ADHD. So inattentive plus anxious, tense, nervous, disorganized, gets anxious about time tests, social anxiety predicts the worst, self-medicates to calm, and often has physical stress symptoms such as headaches and gastrointestinal symptoms. So low prefrontal, again, high basal ganglia. So remember, the basal ganglia is in the emotional brain. They have low dopamine and low GABA. So we can see it there. Okay, so I hope this video was really informative. If you want more information on the 7 different types, there is a course that's being released, and please subscribe to my channel. And if you have more questions, or if you want my particular PowerPoint notes, just let me know, and I'm also available for consulting. Thank you so much for listening. Take care. Bye.